Smoke on the borders, ash in the morning sky, black flags on the hilltops, but hope still learning how to rise. A hobbit with shaking hands, pocket full of simple things, carrying a world of weight on a thin and shining ring. Light against the shadow, fire against the cold, step by trembling step, the quiet hearts grow bold. From the Shire to the high roads where the dark wind sings, we are standing, we are singing for the Lord.
That's the folkens, welcome back to another video. We are going to continue our journey with Middle-earth lore and history, so let's go.
While these battles were raging, Frodo, Sam and Gollum had safely traversed the Dead Marshes and made their way to Ithilien, where they were captured by the elite unit of the Gondorian army, the Ithilien Rangers. During an interrogation,
that's the guys who killed the elephant and the Easterlings army, right?
Conducted by Faramir, Sam accidentally gave away the information that Frodo bore the ring. But fortunately for all involved, the captain of the Rangers proved his quality to be of the highest order. Recognizing the importance of their quest, he allowed the company to continue on their journey, which headed towards the Morgul Vale and from there into Mordor. He would face massive consequences for such an action from his father, but considered it a slight price to pay, stating, "But fear no more, I would not take this thing if it lay by the highway. Not were Minas Tirith falling in ruin, and I alone could save her, so using the weapon of the Dark Lord for her good and my glory. No, I do not wish for such triumphs, Frodo, son of Drogo."
Drogo?
Seeing his ally utterly destroyed,
Is that Frodo's dad's name?
Sauron now turned his eye firmly upon Gondor and the gleaming white bastion of Minas Tirith. If Sauron's true strength could be brought to bear upon the city before Rohan could answer its call for aid, the Age of Man would fall, soon to be replaced by a final Dark Age of Sauron. Yet despite the might he could bring to bear upon the Gondorians, Sauron still knew fear, as the Ranger from the north looked set to take up his rightful mantle as King of Gondor, and the One Ring remained beyond his grasp and inching ever towards destruction. Following on from the Battle of the Hornburg, Gandalf, accompanied by Theoden, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Treebeard, Merry and Pippin, approached the imposing might of Isengard, which the Ents could not breach due to its superior Númenórean design, and confronted Saruman, who, spiteful and proud even in defeat, refused the pleas of Gandalf to surrender.
Yeah, it's pretty wild to think that one tower is a Númenórean outpost. Like, it's just a terrible design. It looks cool, but it's really terrible design to live in.
Forcing the White Wizard to reluctantly expel his former friend from the Order, destroying his staff and leaving him powerless. Grima Wormtongue also refused the mercy of King Theoden, instead hurling Saruman's palantir at the king, narrowly missing him. Ever curious, Pippin...
Why did we not see this in the movies?
Dived into the watery depths now encompassing the fortress, recovering the palantir which had been corrupted by Sauron. The young hobbit came face to face with the Dark Lord himself, but paralyzed by fear, said nothing. Still, his presence confirmed the defeat of Saruman, driving an icy shard of fear into Sauron. In the meantime, Saruman was left to his own devices, with the Ents to serve as his keepers. Upon returning to Helm's Deep, the group was met by the Grey Company, consisting of the remaining 31 members of the Dunedain, led by Aragorn's lieutenant Halbarad, and the twin sons of Elrond, Elladan and Elrohir. They brought with them...
Is it just me, or have I forgotten that Elrond has sons? Why don't we see them in the movies either? That would be pretty cool, honestly.
Advice from Galadriel and Elrond, as well as a standard made by Arwen, depicting the White Tree.
Like a lot of characters in the story of Lord of the Rings that's not in the movies, that I think is like weird.
Upon a black background, with a crown placed above the tree, symbolizing what was to come. The decision was made that the heir of Isildur must make his presence known to his greatest adversary. Gazing deep within the Palantir, and holding the reforged blade, Anduril, Flame of the West, Aragorn confronted the Dark Lord, revealing that the heir of Isildur was soon to return as King of Gondor. Believing that Aragorn was now in possession of the One Ring, while also about to unite all of the free folk of Middle-earth behind his banner, the Dark Lord panicked. His well-laid plans were hastened, as he now saw the need for a preemptive strike on Gondor before Aragorn could assume the throne.
That's interesting. I think in the movies, it kind of seems like this was the plan to attack Gondor with this massive army, right? That's why it was so well prepared in the movies. So in the original story, Sauron was panicking and just sent in an army to take Gondor. Damn.
Having been shown the sheer might of Sauron's forces through the Palantir, Aragorn was also forced to take desperate measures, in this instance departing the now rallying Rohirrim to walk the paths of the dead in order to save his people. Gandalf left the king to continue his muster, taking Pippin with him to Minas Tirith with all the haste his mount Shadowfax could muster, and before long they came before the Ramos Ekor, or the Long Wall as it was often called.
Yeah, I think I remember in the movies, the wall to Minas Tirith was really, really big. And they had, I think they needed this huge battling ram. That they, with was it a bear or wolf head? They had to break through, where it was trolls that needed to use it. It was pretty wild.
This fortification served as Minas Tirith's second line of defense should Osgiliath fall, consisting of a large wall which took an elliptical course around the plains of Pelennor. At its center stood the causeway.
Wait, is this not the wall to the city?
Forts, twin towers.
I don't remember another wall.
That could be held against large numbers. Yet, in a sign of the decaying strength of the kingdom, these walls had been left to the elements for many years, and when passing through, Gandalf and Pippin witnessed hasty and desperate attempts to patch up the
That's a second wall?
fortifications.
I
Further
did not get that in the movie. That would have been pretty nice to have in the movies.
adding to the woes of the Gondorians, they no longer possessed enough soldiers to man the unwieldy defenses. Arriving at the city, Pippin was overtaken by its sheer size and...
If that wall is so big that you can't even see it near the city right now. Yo, that gotta be big, though. Damn, that's wild.
majesty. Yet Gandalf was not as impressed, seeing a city resigned to its defeat, as the majority of the citizenry had been sent out into the fiefdoms of the kingdom, and a rallying call had been sent out by the steward Denethor. However, the threat of an incoming fleet of corsairs from Umbar had severely limited the numbers sent from the outlying regions of Gondor. The muster itself amounted to 200 well-armed men from Lossarnach, 300 from Ringlow Vale, 500 bowmen from Morthond, 150 scantily equipped levies from Anfalas, 50 hillmen from Larnedon, 100 fisherfolk from Ethir Anduin, 300 from Pinath Gelin, and 1,200 men from Dol Amroth.
Okay,
the
so
latter
we are around, what, 2,500?
Were led by the Prince of Dol Amroth, Imrahil, who immediately assumed a leadership role in the defense of the city. He brought with him the very flower of the Gondorian forces, the heavily armed and armored Swan Knights, the only known horsemen in Middle-earth who could potentially best their Rohirrim allies. While each of these men did not lack for valor or the willingness to die for their land, their strength and numbers were lower than any time before. Arriving within the Tower of Ecthelion, Gandalf was left even more worried by the mental state of Denethor, steward of Gondor, who appears to be
useless in the movies, honestly. How he was just so...
completely distraught, due to the death of his son Boromir, as well as the pervading influence of Sauron through his usage of the Palantir of Minas Tirith. Pippin, feeling responsible for the loss of the steward's son at the hands of the Uruk-hai at Amon-Hen, immediately pledged himself to the steward and was brought into Denethor's service.
Okay.
Meanwhile, Faramir had ordered his company of Rangers of Ithilien to reinforce the garrison of Osgiliath, and then returned to Minas Tirith, chased by the fell beasts of the Nazgûl, and barely made it inside the walls due to the timely intervention of Gandalf, who flew through the gates of the city upon his steed Shadowfax. He revealed his true power upon that day, driving back the Nine with the might of his power, and even making the Witch King recoil in what resembled fear if he could still feel such a human emotion.
Damn.
Faramir then informed his father, as well as Gandalf and Pippin, of the survival of Frodo and Sam, as well as their continued travels towards the Morgul Vale. Denethor was furious with the failure of his son to bring the One Ring to Gondor, and lamented that he had lived and Boromir had not, before sending his son to hold the western portion of Osgiliath at all costs. A strategy which Faramir disagreed with, knowing that it most likely would cost him his life. Ever the most dutiful of sons, Faramir took up this responsibility, but not before saying to his father, "Then farewell, but if I should return, think better of me," and hearing, "That depends on the manner of your return," in response. Faramir returned to Osgiliath that same day, and began to make ready the defences of the city, of which they only maintained control of the western portion.
So he basically just told his son that I will think better of you if you come back as a corpse or a victor.
The eastern portion lay in the hands of a massive horde of orcs, which was estimated to number between 70 and 100,000, and while overall command...
And we just gathered, what, 2,500? Oh my god. No wonder in the movies they didn't stand a chance.
Was given to the Witch King of Angmar. His lieutenant Gothmog was an adept strategist. He had commanded the orcs stationed on the eastern bank of the Anduin to create as many barges as they could in order to ferry their forces over the...
Is he named after the Balrog in the first age? Wasn't that Gothmog?
...mighty river. On the 9th and 10th of March, the Dark Lord sent a foul cloud from Mordor, covering the lands of Rohan and Gondor in darkness for 2 days, sapping the strength and will of the men of the West as the dawn never arrived. On the same day, a behemoth force emerged from the Black Gate, and force marched itself all the way to Caer Andros, capturing the island in the hopes of cutting off the Rohirrim relief force, which had completed its muster at Dunharrow, while simultaneously another smaller army marched from Minas Morgul to bolster the forces at Osgiliath. Theoden had honoured the pledge of Eorl the Young and assembled 6,000 cavalrymen, among them his niece Eowyn and...
Yeah, they made like the bonfires that went from mountain to mountain to mountain all the way up here. That was such a cool scene. Damn.
Merry, disguised among his riders.
I still don't know like if there's like villages inside these mountains for those people to like live.
This was all he could manage in the time allotted to him, but it remained uncertain as to whether or not they would arrive in time.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Aragorn was leading the Grey Company, Gimli and Legolas, through the paths of the dead. His plan was to recruit the dead men of Dunharrow, who betrayed their oath to Isildur during the War of the Last Alliance. As the heir of Isildur, Aragorn had the ability to release them from their oath and undead existence.
So that's why they did not fight in the War of the Last Alliance. So they are just trapped in this world. Yo, those curses in Lord of the Rings are like out of control. I remember, like, we didn't see that many curses, if we even saw any in the second age. But like the first age, it was like curse, but like you could step on somebody's toe and they cursed your entire bloodline. Like it was insane.
Dead men joined him. At the same time, the Orcish host, alongside their Haradrim reinforcements, attacked Osgiliath on the 11th of March. The rangers of Athelian and Gondorian regulars made the hordes of orcs pay for every step they took through the former capital, and proved their worth despite the unfavourable odds. After a day of fighting, however, the weight of numbers soon took its toll, pushing the men of Gondor from the city and forcing them to take up further positions along the Ramas Ekor. The fighting was at its fiercest at the Causeway forts, as Faramir personally led the defence here, and knowing that time was of the essence, refused to give an inch of ground to the forces of Mordor. The Ramas Ekor was too large a bastion to hold, given the numbers provided to the young captain of Gondor, and having held another day here, they were forced into a retreat on the 13th of March. What started as an orderly withdrawal soon turned into a rout, as the battered and broken forces of Gondor attempted to make their way back to the White City. Yet the Pelennor fields offered no cover to Faramir or his men. They were overtaken by the forces of the Dark Lord, and a fierce melee ensued, in which Faramir was struck down by a poisonous dart, commonly used by the forces of the Southrons, and left near death.
Is this the knights, Swan Knights?
His men, loyal to their captain above all else, shielded his body, and stood willing to fight to the last man if it meant saving their leader. This proved unnecessary, however, as Prince Imrahil led a sortie of his Swan Knights after getting Denethor's approval. The sheer ferocity and strength of these scions of an age long since past saved the lives of the remainder of the garrison of Osgiliath, their swan-shaped helms driving fear into the hearts of the orcs and Southrons, who themselves turned to rout. With Gandalf once more driving off the Nazgûl, who had grown to fear the light of Istari once more, Imrahil, coming upon the stricken body of his friend and nephew, hoisted Faramir upon his horse and rode back to the city with all haste in search of a healer. Upon hearing of his son's injury, Denethor finally gave way to madness, locking himself within the White Tower, preparing a pyre for himself and his son to burn upon, despite Pippin's protestations.
Yeah, that's why he tried to burn Faramir alive.
Left the defense of the city to Gandalf, who was aided by the immensely capable Prince Imrahil, with the regular forces of Gondor joined by the survivors of the Ramas Ekor. While the defeat at Osgiliath had been resounding, and Faramir's injury deprived them of another capable leader for the battle which was to come, the time he had bought in his desperate defense would prove pivotal in giving time for the Rohirrim to arrive and fulfill their. This had been symbolized by the red arrow of Yol, which had been presented to King Theoden at Dunharrow, a gesture which...
What? What about the bonfires in the movies? Are you telling me the real story is they sent an arrow? Okay. I cannot blame the guy who made Lord of the Rings movies for not changing that. That's so stupid. The cool bonfires, come on. Like...
once again called upon the old oaths of friendship to be fulfilled. Not long after the defeat at Ramas Ekor and the near-mortal wounding of one of the last great captains of Gondor, Faramir, the forces of Mordor amassed upon the plains of Pelennor. The Witch King brought with him tens of thousands of orcs and men of Khand, Rhûn and Harad, alongside Oliphants and Trolls.
It's crazy
they began to build
that we have been through, what, 10,000 years of history.
Siege equipment and dug trenches.
I've been skipping a lot though.
While a sizable portion of the army, consisting of both orcs and Easterlings, was sent to protect the northern roads from the arrival of the Rohirrim. Here they also dug trenches and placed wooden spikes within them, in order to negate the advantage of the Rohirrim cavalry, which remained famed throughout all of Middle-earth, before settling into their fortifications. The siege began on the 13th of March, as the Witch King attempted to soften the defences of Minas Tirith with a massive bombardment of their walls. This initial attempt failed miserably, as the outer wall of the city, Othram, was built by the Númenóreans using black rock, and was as...
Is the entire city not built by the Númenóreans? Huh, did not know that it had like a black rock front. But haven't I heard that before? It actually sounds familiar, but it's not in the movies. Huh.
Impregnable as the Tower of Orthanc. This forced the forces of Mordor to change tactics, and incendiary ammunition was fired over the wall, setting the lower city ablaze. The orcs also began firing salvos of the decapitated heads of the fallen at Osgiliath in an attempt to destroy the defenders' morale. In response to this, Gandalf, accompanied by Prince Imrahil, made circuits of the Othram, inspiring all who they met to remain steadfast despite the sheer size of the enemy at their gates.
There are honestly more soldiers here in than it looks like in the movies. Like in the movies, doesn't look like they have that many.
Same day, Aragorn, meeting with the southern Gondorian army, took command and made his way to meet with the Corsair fleet, which was now bearing down on Minas Tirith.
Didn't Aragorn just Legolas and Gimli just faced those ship guys with they took those ships with the ghost dudes and then attacked at Pelennor Fields, right?
This force consisted of archers from the Blackroot Vale near Erich, infantry from Lebanon and Lamadon, and a number of other less distinguished units. Yet their support would prove vital in the battle to come. The forces of the king intercepted the Corsair fleet at the famous port city of Peligir in what would later become known as the Battle of Peligir, which was Aragorn's first battle on Gondorian soil since he served in the employ of Denethor's father under the name of Thoringil many years past. The Corsairs, who were not famed for their discipline, had erred in stopping to loot and plunder every port town they
that how old Aragorn actually is. Like the guy is really, really old.
Came across during their journey towards Minas Tirith, and Aragorn's forces caught them right in the middle of just such an operation. The latter quickly divided his troops among his respective commanders, and they began to pick off the smaller looting parties of the Corsairs. At the same time, the forces of the dead cut a bloody swath through the Corsairs, who were struck by such fear that many jumped from their ships at the sight of the men of Dunharrow rather than face them. In this way, Aragorn quickly liberated the city, and now bolstered by the mariners of Peligir, his troops could swiftly make their way up the Anduin to relieve the besieged Gondor. Aragorn was, however, a man of his word, and first released the Oathbreakers from their torment, announcing that their oaths had been fulfilled, before sending his makeshift...
Wait, but the ghosts were at Pelennor Fields. Why is he releasing them now for this minor battle? I mean, come on. You have like, what, 100,000 more orcs you need to fight, and huge elephants and trolls.
Flotilla on its way. While the first attempts at breaking the morale of the Gondorians had failed due to the leadership of Gandalf and Imrahil, the Easterlings, using their Mumakil, had pulled the siege towers closer to the wall during the night, and the next day would prove pivotal. The men of Gondor held firm, however, repulsing each wave of orcs and Easterlings respectively, destroying many of their siege towers in the process. Unfortunately for them, the necessity of defending the wall in its entirety from the siege towers meant that the Great Gate, which was the only weakness in the otherwise impenetrable wall, could not be defended sufficiently. Here Gandalf and Imrahil positioned themselves and led the defense of the gate, with the casualties on the part of the besiegers immense due to the unwillingness of the defenders to give any ground, in spite of the unending waves of haste. While the odds seemed stacked against them, as no messenger had been received accounting for reinforcements, the Rohirrim had progressed farther than one would have expected in their attempts to reach the city.
Really?
This was due to the aid of Gan Burigan, who was the chief of the Druedain of Druedan Forest, an ancient race of men who dwelt within the forest and refused to succumb to the corruption of the Dark Lord, despite his growing influence among the men of the West. Though small in number and in stature, they had warded off a large orcish force using hit-and-run tactics, as well as exceptionally potent poisoned arrows. When Theoden and his 6,000 arrived at the eaves of the forest, they were greeted by Gan Burigan and a company of his men, who warned him of the force who now blocked his path to Minas Tirith. Sensing the urgency of the situation, The chieftain wasted no time in leading the Riders of the Mark through the forest, bypassing the force of orcs and Heredrim, allowing them to arrive at the Ramas Ekor at dawn on March 15th.
Damn.
The situation in Minas Tirith, despite the valiant efforts of its defenders, was worsening. The forces of Mordor had brought forth a great battering ram, known as Grond, named in honor of the Warhammer which the original Dark Lord Morgoth had wielded in battle in times long since past.
Oh, the one he killed Fingolfin with. Damn, that's wild.
This Hammer of the Underworld had been forged in the foundries of Barad-dûr, specifically
Of course Sauron will remember that mace.
for the purpose of bringing down the Great Gate of Minas Tirith.
Rest in peace.
The siege work itself was 60 feet in height and 150 long. Created of harsh metals, it maintained a permanent
Honestly,
flame.
like, Fingolfin might be one of my favorite characters in this entire, like, story. Yeah. Fingolfin and Turin. Yeah. And Tur. Ah, have I forgotten the name now? Tur is the one that I liked. I think wasn't Turin was the one that married his sister. Yeah. So it's Tur and Fingolfin. Yeah. Those were like the best characters. I liked Malfrost for a period, but like at the end of this first age, he just died to me completely. And I did not care that he threw himself into a volcano.
And its wolf-like
I still think that the volcano might be where the Misty Mountain is right now, and the Arkenstone is a Sumeriel.
more, evidencing the vile sorcery used in its creation, and would require a great many trolls to even operate it. Despite its sturdiness, the Great Gate was no match for the greatest siege equipment of the Third Age, and was weakened by the Witch King's sorcery. According to our primary source on the battle, thrice the great ram boomed, and suddenly upon the last stroke, the gate of Gondor broke. As if stricken by some blasting spell, it burst asunder. There was a blast of searing lightning, and the doors tumbled in riven fragments to the ground. The gate had been destroyed utterly, and the forces of the Dark Lord seemed poised to storm the city by force.
Huge trolls with armor on attack. Damn.
The Witch King, upon his fell beast, entered the city first, believing the battle to be all but won. Standing before him in the Courtyard of Kings was Gandalf the White, mounted upon Shadowfax, who confronted the greatest servant of the Dark Lord and his endless tides, which were ready to destroy the greatest city of man. The Witch King was at first uncertain, having seen firsthand the power the White Wizard could bring to bear, so the standoff continued for what seemed like an unceasing moment in time. Just as the two looked set to finally test the prophecy uttered so long ago in Arnor, a horn was heard far off in the fields of Pelennor, a horn both the Witch King and the White Wizard recognized.
This is like my favorite scene in Lord of the Rings. This is like the one that like stuck to me the most, right?
The sons of Eorl had come forth with the future of Middle-earth now resting upon their intervention. The Witch King quickly fled the courtyard, sensing the gravity of the situation his forces now faced. However, Gandalf could not give pursuit, as he received ill news from Pippin of the fate of Faramir. Denethor, having made use of the Palantir one last time, finally had succumbed to the madness, and with his will now broke, sighed. Unfortunately, believing his son was now dying, he sought to end Faramir's life alongside his, and had ordered a pyre to be constructed on which he would have them both burned.
Jesus.
Pippin protested and was ejected from the room. In a panic, he ran to Beregond of the Citadel, whose love of Faramir overrode his sense of duty to the city, and he rushed into the burial chambers of the kings of Gondor, preventing the pyre from being burned, while Pippin sought out Gandalf's aid.
Yo, this is way different from the movies, because like in the movies it was Pippin that jumped in to save Faramir. And then Gandalf's horse kicked the dad off. They kicked him down, right away from Pippin, and then he burned.
When Gandalf arrived with Pippin, they saw that Beregond had been forced to slay several of the attendants in an attempt to delay the murder-suicide. Gandalf was able to save Faramir. However, the despair of Denethor was so great that even in knowing his son would survive, he elected to cast himself upon the pyre. So ended the life of Denethor, who would be remembered as a strong ruler who was corrupted by evil. King Theoden of Rohan emerged upon a hillock on the edge of the Pelennor fields at the head of 6,000 riders of Rohan, where he looked down upon the doom of his age and did not falter, despite the immensity of the fight which now awaited the aged warrior king. The ranks of Orcs and Southrons now turned to face the new foe, which had emerged seemingly from nowhere. They had been caught unawares, and could not effectively reconfigure their formations to face what was to come. Theoden, turning to his men, organized his commanders, asking of them that they fear no darkness that day, before addressing the 6,000, now numbering as one of the greatest kings to ever have sat upon the throne of his forefathers. Arise, arise, riders of Theoden! Fell deeds awake, fire and slaughter, spear shall be shaken, shield be splintered, a sword day, a red day, ere the sun rises! The chant of death was taken up by the warriors of the Mark, as a cacophony of shouts, cheers, and horn blasts filled the air, further breaking the morale of the forces of the Dark Lord. Before Theoden pulled his horse, Snowmane, once more to face the might of Sauron, with a light jolt to the side of his trusty mount, the horse jolted forward, and with this came a thundering of hooves that had never before been heard upon the field of Pelennor. 6,000 of Rohan crashed forward, first meeting the hordes of Orcs, which hastily arranged in a pike formation. The servants of Sauron were powerless to stop the flowing tide of cavalry, and were swept under the hooves of the king and his men with ease.
Nice.
Sensing the desperation of the situation, the great chieftain of the Haradrim mounted a countercharge, meeting Theoden head-on in brutal single combat. The fight dragged on, yet the old king did not falter, and struck down his enemy with all the vigor of a man half his age. The Haradrim were further slaughtered as the Rohirrim pushed ever onwards, destroying everything in their path and killing their king, until Theoden looked upon his final foe. The Witch King of Angmar, on his fell beast, swooped downward, mortally wounding the king under the weight of his beloved steed. The sheer terror the Lord of the Nazgul instilled caused Theoden's honor guard to rout, save for one who was known to his comrades as Denhelm throughout the march to Minas Tirith. It was in fact the king's niece, Eowyn, disguised as a man alongside the hobbit Merry. Unwilling to bow before the terror of the Nazgul, she boldly stood her ground, displaying the same courage her king had moments earlier. The Witch King then confidently stated that no living man can kill me, to which the Shield Maiden of Rohan removed her helmet and responded, "No living man am I, you look upon a woman. Eowyn I am, Eamond's daughter. Begone, if you be not deathless, for living or dark undead I will smite you if you touch him." Now she stood alone before the Lord of the Nine, and struck down his fell beast in defense of her beloved uncle, cleaving the beast's neck in one fell swing of her blade. The infuriated Witch King attacked Eowyn with great malice, hefting a large mace, and shattered her shield, breaking her arm in the process and forcing her back. It was at this point that Meriadoc Brandybuck stabbed the creature in the leg with the barrow blade he had picked up so long ago in his journey. The dagger was of the make of the land of Arnor, and caused the Nazgul immense pain, bringing him to his knees, while also breaking Merry's arm with the force of the impact.
Really?
Eowyn, then regaining her footing, thrust her blade through the Witch King's helm, finally fulfilling Glorfindel's prophecy at the Battle of Fornost that not by the hand of man would the leader of the Nine be defeated.
Interesting. So, man can also mean men, not just humans in this world. It can also mean men, apparently. Huh. Seems I'm not the only one who is confused by that. The Witch King was apparently too.
Badly weakened by the fight, she succumbed to the Black Breath, which was a result of direct contact with a Nazgul, leaving her hovering close to death. Merry then dragged himself closer to the now dying King of Rohan, and was there to hear the dying words of Theoden, Lord of the Mark. "Farewell, Master Hobbit. My body is broken. I go to my fathers, and even in their mighty company, I shall not now be ashamed." Eomer, despite his heartbreak at the loss of his beloved uncle, and the perceived loss of his sister, now assumed control of the Rohirrim. The charge, slowed but not stopped, continued.
Perceived loss of his sister? What do you mean by that? He didn't know his sister was fighting. Plus, he just won her fight.
To wreak devastation among the forces of Mordor. The men of Gondor began their own sortie from the gates, catching their foes unawares, and also inflicting heavy casualties upon the forces which were closest to the gate. First among them was Imrahil and his mounted Swan Knights, who cut a bloody swath through the forces of the Dark Lord in an attempt to reach Eomer. The fighting grew bloody and desperate, as the
I just googled the name earlier.
immense weight of the Mumakil and Haradrim, alongside the reserve.
I just called them Oliphants. The Mumakil. Did I Google wrong?
Of the orcs kept the men of the west separated, allowing the numerical advantage to once more turn the battle in favor of the servants of the Dark Lord, even in the absence of their overall commander. It was at this point that the hearts of every man of the west sunk as the ships of the corsairs of Umbar arrived. Despite thinking that their defeat and destruction were inevitable, they fought on. Neither side expected Aragorn, alongside the Grey Company and the southern army of Gondor, to emerge from the ships. Yet the impact of this sudden appearance, symbolized by the unfurling of Arwen's banner by Halbarad, was felt by both sides of the conflict. The newly arrived men of the west, with Aragorn at their head, wielding the blade Anduril, drove a wedge through the forces of the Dark Lord, separating those closest to the city from those nearer to the Anduin. None among the servants of Sauron could stand before the might of Anduril that day, as Aragorn swept aside all who stood in his way, cutting deep into the host which threatened his city. Capitalizing upon these unexpected reinforcements, Imrahil and Eomer marshaled their flagging forces time and again through repeated cavalry and infantry charges, cutting off divisions of the Great Horde and slaughtering them en masse. Most of the host of Mordor was slain, with the orcs now seeing that victory had slipped from their grasp, fleeing and being cut down in the thousands, with many more drowning as they attempted to cross the Anduin to safety. A large force of Easterlings, whose hatred for the men of Gondor outweighed their own instincts for self-preservation, refused to flee the field and fought to the last man, earning the bitter respect of the men of the West. Some of the more disciplined orcs rallied a rearguard of sorts, and were successful in inflicting heavy casualties upon both the Gondorian and Rohirrim forces, but soon they were overrun too, with Aragorn finishing the last ones off, effectively ending the Orcish resistance and the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. The losses on both sides were considerable, with nearly the entirety of the forces of Mordor utterly destroyed. This was of little consequence to Sauron, however, as he still possessed large numbers of orcs within the plains of Gorgoroth, alongside his experimental new Uruk-hai units. It was the loss of his chief lieutenant,
How are they surviving in this? Because from what I remember, like, Mordor was pretty desolate.
Witch King of
like he just lost the Witch King. Like, that was like his top commander. Like,
Bangmar, which he ruled most, as he remained irreplaceable in the eyes of the Dark Lord.
True.
Casualties suffered by the men of the West were also substantial, with Theoden chief among their number. Eomer estimated that less than 4,000 Rohirrim were now capable of battle, with a large number of his forces dead, injured, or having lost their mounts. All in all, however, Aragorn estimated that even with the soldiers he would need in the coming conflict, the garrison of Minas Tirith, with the addition of the southern armies, was now greater than it had been before the siege. Despite his triumphant return to the lands of his forefathers as Isildur's heir, Aragorn, taking counsel
To be fair, there weren't that many in the first place, so...
from those around him, opted not to immediately take the crown. The possibility for counterclaimants, or those who would actively oppose the return of the king, was too great a chance to take at a stage where the fate of Middle-earth still hung upon a knife's edge.
Who'd oppose it? Like, come on. I don't think Faramir has a problem with it.
Aragorn sought to act as a healer to his people, immediately curing Faramir and Éowyn, who barely clung to life, before turning his attention to the others.
What happened to Éowyn? She won the battle, and I remember, like, she was fine in, like, the movies. Right, like, she took up the helmet and it's like, I'm not a man. And then stabbed the Witch King in his face.
Who had fought so bravely in the defense of the city, saving many lives and easing the suffering of his people everywhere he went. Selfless acts immediately won over the likes of Faramir. It was his humility and self-sacrifice, exhausted as he was, that won over the people of Gondor. This also fulfilled the prophecy of Eoreth, the chief healer within the city at the time. Okay. The hands of the king are the hands of a healer, and so shall the rightful king be known. He continued to heal people between March 15th and 16th within the walls of the White City, thereafter symbolically leaving the city and refusing to return until the future of Middle-earth had been resolved in favor of the free folk, as preparations were already being made for a final conflict to match that of the sheer immensity of the final days of the War of the Last Alliance. Sauron's attack on the Northern Realms was foreseen by Gandalf many years earlier, leading the then Grey Wizard to aid Thorin in his quest to reclaim the Lonely Mountain. Gandalf had seen through the guise of the Necromancer of Dol Guldur much earlier and predicted that Sauron would make use of the sheer destruction Smaug could unleash in order to destroy Gondor. The dragon's death at the hand of Bard severely dented the Dark Lord's plans, giving the free peoples of Middle-earth a fighting chance in the war to come, while the newly re-established Kingdom of Dale and Kingdom Under the Mountain provided a vital northern bulwark against the forces of Sauron.
Yeah, where were they,
in TA 3018, Gloin revealed to the Council of Elrond that messengers had arrived at the gates of the Lonely Mountain.
Where were all the dwarves, by the way? Like, and all of the elves? Like, have the elves just left?
Sent on behalf of Sauron, seeking information on the Shire and the Hobbits, while also asking for them to turn over Bilbo's ring. Further, they asked for the submission of the kingdoms to Mordor's overlordship, and when these entreaties were refused, dire consequences had been threatened. Messengers likewise approached King Brand of Dale, and when similar requests were refused, Easterlings loyal to the Dark Lord began to
Dale is like way bigger territory than I thought.
Gather on the outskirts of Dale. Likewise, in the realm of Thranduil and that of Lothlorien, the numbers of foul creatures encroaching ever further from Dol Guldur into Mirkwood alerted the elves to the fact that they would not be left unscathed in the coming conflict. Thranduil, Celeborn and Galadriel made what preparations they could. However, many of the finest warriors of the elves had at this stage committed to sailing west to Valinor, leaving the respective elvish forces weakened. This northern theatre of the War of the Ring, therefore, pitted the last of the declining races of elves and dwarfs against the ascendant forces of the Dark Lord, with the outcome of pitched battles remaining exceptionally uncertain. War would come first to Dale, however, as on the 17th of March, TA 3019, the massive Easterling host crossed the borders of the kingdom, intending to invade and capture the city. The Easterlings were mainly composed of well-equipped and well-drilled warriors from Rhûn, surprising the forces of Dale and the Lonely Mountain with the speed at which they crossed the Redwater River, given their
numbers. Not see this war in like Lord of the Rings. That would have been pretty cool.
Kings Brand and Dane II quickly assembled their forces, and it could be estimated that there were 2,500
Dane, isn't that Thorin's cousin?
Dwarves of Erebor and of the Iron Hills, alongside 3,500 men of Dale. compared to that of the 20,000 strong force of Easterlings. This assault coincided with the siege of Minas Tirith in order to prevent any aid coming to Gondor from the north, tying down these forces in a manner Saruman was unable to achieve with the Riders of Rohan. The two kings met the Easterlings in open battle on the same day the Easterlings crossed the river, hoping to prevent the destruction of Dale, putting their faith in the fact that the foundries of Erebor gave them a massive advantage in terms of their arms and armor. 3 days of heavy fighting ensued, wherein the steadfastness of the dwarves and men of Dale was eventually eroded by the numerical advantage possessed by the men of Rhun, forcing them to retreat. Seeing that Lake Town would be indefensible, the combined force of men and dwarves attempted to retreat behind the impregnable gates of the Lonely Mountain, with Kings Brand and Dane leading a desperate rearguard action. The two kings managed to buy enough time for their forces to fall back into the mountains. However, Brand was struck down by an Easterling's blade before the gate of the Lonely Mountain. Dane, enraged by the death of his close friend and ally, stood over Brand's corpse and refused to give an inch despite the intense pressure exerted by the far more numerous Easterling force. After a prolonged defense of the King of Dale's body, the Dwarven King under the mountain was also slain, despite the piles of Easterling casualties that mounted around the stalwart king. The forces of the deceased leaders then locked the gates of the mountain and prepared for a prolonged siege. While the men of Dale and dwarves of Erebor and the Iron Hills remained besieged behind the gates of the Lonely Mountain, their primary hope for victory lay with the men of the West, led by the soon-to-be King of Gondor, Aragorn.
Is Aragorn going to
Even
join?
earlier, Lothlorien had been invaded by a host of orcs coming out of Dol Guldur, first on the 11th of March TA 3019, then again on the 15th, and a final assault was then made upon the Elvish lands on the 22nd of March. Meanwhile, on the 15th of March TA 3019, Thranduil's realm was invaded by a large horde of orcs, beginning what would become known as the Battle Under the Trees. This was done to secure the flank of the assaults on Lothlorien, and prevent the great rulers of the elves converging and forming a unified front against the orcs of Dol Guldur. The Easterlings of Rhun were to reinforce the assault. However, they had been slowed immeasurably by the stubbornness of the defenders of Erebor. The Galadrim, led by Celeborn and Galadriel, repulsed each assault, relying heavily upon the courage and potency of the renowned elvish swordsman, alongside the power of Galadriel's ring, to counteract the vast numerical advantage of Dol Guldur. While Thranduil also proved his competency in personally leading the elven counterattack, the Elven King, whose forces were more renowned for their deadly archers, emerged victorious after a battle which caused a great ruin of fire throughout the woods.
Yeah, I remember like the martial powers in The Hobbit. They were pretty wild.
Victory caused Thranduil to declare a new year of the elves shortly after their victory. At this point, Frodo and Sam, alongside their guide Gollum, had made their way to the passes of Cirith Ungol, where the treachery of Gollum was revealed, turning the hobbits against one another, before leading Frodo into the clutches of Shelob, a great spider of immense proportions, and one of the last true descendants of the original Dark Lord Morgoth's ally, Ungoliant. Shelob pricked Frodo with her stinger, causing him to become immobilized, and easy prey for the great spider. Sam, however, wielding Sting and the Light of Arendil, fought off the foul beast, saving Frodo's life once more.
Damn.
However, believing his dear friend to be dead, he took the ring, and despite his despair, intended to finish their quest regardless. At this point, a group of orcs and uruks from the garrison of Cirith Ungol came upon Frodo's body, and remarked that he was still alive, before bringing him to the tower for questioning. Sam then took it upon himself to save the ring-bearer's life once more, and taking advantage of the fact that the garrison had engaged in a mild civil war between the orcs and uruks for the ownership of Frodo's mithril shirt, was able to reach Frodo before he could come to harm. Here he returned the ring, counting himself among only the company of Bilbo, having handed over the one ring, while also being the only individual to have ever done so willingly. From here, the two hobbits, disguising themselves as best they could, began the perilous journey across the plains of Gorgoroth, which was inhabited by thousands of orcs, in order to complete their quest and cast the ring into the fire. Meanwhile, following the successful defense of Minas Tirith,
Begin to
Aragorn gathered to him
battle
all
the
of the
Black Gate.
wise men of Gondor, as well as his companions and the most prominent men of Rohan, in order to discuss their final moves in the dying embers of the War of the Ring. This came to be known as the Last Debate, and was conducted outside of the walls of the city, as Aragorn refused to enter until the war had been won and he could be properly proclaimed king. Many men who were well acquainted with tactics and warfare, such as Imrahil and Eomer, put forward their opinions as to the best course of action. Yet it was the counsel of Gandalf which swayed Aragorn, with the wizard remarking, "We have not the ring. Without it we cannot by force defeat his force. But we must at all costs keep his eye from his true peril. We cannot achieve victory by arms, but by arms we can give the ring-bearer his only chance, frail though it be. We must push Sauron to his last throw. We must call out his hidden strength, so that he shall empty his land. We must march out to meet him at once. We must make ourselves the bait, though his jaws should close on us. We must walk open-eyed into that trap, with courage, but small hope for ourselves." Knowing that Frodo and Sam were now within the depths of Mordor, they were left with no other choice but to march out and meet the Dark Lord. By sacrificing their lives, they could buy the ring-bearer enough time to complete his quest and save Middle-earth for good and all. Each and every one of those gathered at this last debate knew that it was likely death awaited them, yet it was the only course of action now left to them. A garrison of a size greater than had originally guarded the city was left, and the Captain of the West took with him 7,000 soldiers of Gondor and Rohan, alongside his Grey Company. The impossibility of victory was not lost on the men of the West, however, with Imrahil laughing aloud before stating, "Surely this is the greatest jest in all the history of Gondor, that we should ride with 7,000, scarce as many as the vanguard of its army in the days of its power, to assail the mountains and the impenetrable gate of the Black Land. So might a child threaten a mail-clad knight with a bow of string and green willow." The host of the Men of the West left Minas Tirith on March 18th, and bypassed Minas Morgul, heading straight for the Black Gate. Sauron, falsely believing that Aragorn now possessed the ring, and would use its power against him, fell for this ploy, and began to send all of his warriors to the Black Gate. Aragorn then left a force of just under 1,000 men at the crossroads, in order to guard the road to Minas Tirith should the battle go poorly. Midway through Ithilien, they were then assaulted by Haradrim and Easterlings. The soldiers were quickly detected by the rangers of Ithilien, however, and driven off with little casualties.
Nice.
As the men of the West approached Dagorlad, a number of the farmers of Lossarnach and some of the fainter of heart among the Rohirrim balked at the prospect of assaulting the Black Gate. Aragorn, displaying his compassion, allowed them to leave, instead sending them to liberate Caer Andros, weakening the army even further, so that they maintained a strength of barely 6,000 men. Yet as the host of the West continued ever onwards, they soon came to see the extraordinary vastness of the Black Gate, and even the most valiant among them began to feel the cold tendrils of fear creep through their veins. Heralds were sent upon Prince Imrahil's suggestion to announce the coming of King Elessar. In response, the Black Gate opened a fraction, allowing for a delegation of the Dark Lord to emerge. At their head was a dark Númenórean of the ancient faction of King's Men who had survived the fall of the kingdom and fallen into the service of Sauron. He was known as the Mouth of Sauron and demanded the surrender of the host, producing Frodo's mithril vest and cloak to the despair of Pippin among Aragorn's retinue.
Yo, he's
Gandalf
like 3,000 years old.
then asked for the terms of surrender, which were to be Sauron's recognized dominion over Isengard and Rohan, as well as the vassalage of Gondor, to which the men of the West refused in the plainest of terms. Enraged by their unwillingness to surrender, the Mouth of Sauron withdrew behind the Black Gate, which now opened, allowing a force of between 60 and 100,000 orcs, trolls and Uruk-hai to emerge. On top of that, thousands of orcs surfaced from the hillsides surrounding the plain of Morannon, with another force of Easterlings appearing from the former Gondorian garrison tower of Karchost, ensuring that the men of the West now knew the true strength of Mordor. These denizens of the dark proceeded to surround the host of the West, ensuring that retreat was no longer an option. In the early stages of the battle, the Dark Lord's warriors found it difficult to reach the men of the West due to the large slag pools and pits of waste that surrounded the Black Gate.
This is a way better strategy than what they did in the movies, but in the movies it looked way better. They just charged in.
This bought Aragorn enough time to organize his soldiers. He placed 2 forces of 3,000 each upon the 2 slag piles in the center of the plain of Morannon, which were made up of piles of rubble and waste. The contingent upon the right hill was commanded by Imrahil and Eomer in the front line, while consisting of the Knights of Dol Amroth and elements of the Tower Guard, among the regulars of both Rohan and Gondor, while the hill to the left was led by Aragorn alongside Gandalf, the remaining members of the Fellowship, Elladen and Elrohir, sons of Elrond, and the Grey Company, with Arwen's banner flying on its front line. The Dark Lord, with his eye fixed firmly upon the battle, urged his subjects forward. His forces crashed into the host of the West.
It's wild to think that Sauron didn't even defend Mount Doom, right? Like, there was one entrance into that mountain.
Like a tide breaking upon the cliffside, the men of the West held, utilizing their superior discipline and martial prowess, as well as the height advantage afforded by the slag piles, to hold back the orcs, trolls, and evil men. While this valiant defense caused far greater casualties on the part of the Dark Lord, it was not sustainable, and the men of the West were hard pushed to keep up this immense effort. The remaining Nazgul then emerged, threatening to dismantle the disciplined lines of the host of the West, before the Great Eagles entered the battle, led by their Windlord Gwaihir. The Eagles and Nazgul fought for aerial superiority, with Pippin echoing the sentiment of Bilbo during the Battle of the Five Armies by repeating aloud, "The Eagles are coming." As the initial attack of the forces of Sauron failed, armored trolls, wielding crude maces and cudgels, were sent forth. Their attack managed to effectively break down the lines of the men of the West, allowing orcs to swarm through, making Aragorn's position borderline untenable on both slag piles. The orcs further took example of the Easterlings and engaged in flanking maneuvers, attempting to make the most of their encirclement. It was only by the valor and steadfastness of Aragorn's soldiers that the defense of the slag piles could be maintained, despite odds. Meanwhile, Sam and Frodo, having disguised themselves as orcs, had at this point reached Mount Doom and looked poised to bring the battle to a premature end. Coming to the slopes of the Crack of Doom, Frodo's strength gave out, however, and he fell, only for Sam to carry him on his back across the last few steps. At this point, Gollum attacked the 2 hobbits, with Sam managing to fight him off as Frodo stumbled towards the depths of Mount Doom. Sam, having delayed Gollum long enough, made his way to the Crack of Doom, where, to his horror, Frodo had renounced the quest and claimed the ring as his own, placing it upon his finger. Sauron, now realizing that the ring was within the depths of Mount Doom, pulled his gaze from the plains of Morannon towards the Crack of Doom, calling the Nazgul to him. This earned the hard-pressed men of the West a reprieve, as without the will of the Dark Lord driving them onwards, his forces began to falter, allowing the warriors on either slag pile breathing space with which they could reform their lines. A shocked and despairing Sam was caught unaware when Gollum attacked him from behind, knocking him unconscious with a rock, before attacking Frodo. The struggle was brief, as Frodo had been weakened by possessing and resisting the will of the ring for as long as he had, ending with Gollum biting off his finger and taking the one ring from him. Gollum celebrated, reclaiming his precious by dancing maniacally. However, he slipped upon the blood pulsing from Frodo's finger, causing him to fall into the Crack of Doom unwittingly, destroying the one
Didn't Frodo push him?
ring. This caused the destruction of Barad-dûr, the Black Gate, and the Towers of the Teeth, while Mount Doom erupted violently, with the 2 hobbits barely escaping to the mountainside, where they were now surrounded by lava and ash, seemingly doomed, before being rescued by Gandalf, Gwaihir, and his Great Eagles. With the destruction of the ring, Sauron's being and his power were forever lost, and the threat of his dominion ended forever. On the plains of Morannon, the orcs panicked and began to flee, being cut down in droves by the resurgent men of the West.
The last enemy of the First Age is gone. Sauron. Damn, that's pretty wild to think about.
While some of the Easterlings and Haradrim, bearing an undying hatred towards their western counterparts, fought to the last man, being utterly destroyed on that.
Why the Haradrim hates the men of the West so much that they would be allied with Sauron?
Day. Others surrendered and were pardoned by King Elessar. Orc strongholds remained within the plains of Gorgoroth, however, necessitating Aragorn to lead his forces, which were still capable of fighting, immediately into the depths of Mordor to ensure the purging of the area was complete. Aragorn then freed the slaves of Nirn, granting them this extremely fertile area in the far south of the realm of Mordor to be ruled as they wished, following their years of enslavement under the cruel reign of Sauron. News of the demise of the Dark Lord spread quickly, with the Easterlings besieging the Lonely Mountain soon hearing of their overlord's destruction, which sapped them of any degree of morale.
Damn.
The armies of Dale and Erebor, now led by their new kings, Bard II and Thorin III Stonehelm, led a sortie consisting of all the forces remaining to them still
named after the OGs.
capable of fighting, and on the 27th of March drove the Easterlings from their lands, ending the siege of the Lonely Mountain. While this was ultimately a victory for Dale and Erebor, the casualties were high, lowering what were already scarce numbers of dwarfs, assuring the ascendancy of man. The elves, using their victory at the battle under the trees, and the fact that the Nazgul were gone with the defeat of their master, attacked Dol Guldur, led by Celeborn, Galadriel and Thranduil. We don't know much about the ensuing battle, but what we know for sure is that in one of the last true examples of the magic in this world, Galadriel came to the gates and cast down the walls, foul pits and crevices. Dol Guldur was finally destroyed, and the forest was cleansed. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Black Gate and the destruction of the One Ring, Aragorn was returning to Gondor to be duly crowned as King Elessar, having been given the name by Galadriel on May 1st, TA 3109. The ceremony was vast in nature, with people from all over Middle-earth coming to witness the events. Faramir met with the soon-to-be king outside the walls of the city, before announcing the return of the king to his people. Here is Aragorn, son of Arathorn, chieftain of the Dunedain of Arnor, captain of the host of the West, bearer of the Star of the North, wielder of the sword reforged, victorious in battle, whose hands bring healing, the Elfstone, Elessar of the line of Valindir, Isildur's son, Elendor's son of Numenor. Shall he be king and enter into the city and dwell there? And all those gathered cried approval aloud in one voice, allowing Aragorn to once more enter the city he had saved not long before, this time not only as a healer, but also as king. Frodo was given the honor of carrying the crown, and Gandalf then placed the wings of pearl and silver, which formed the likeness of a seabird, upon Aragorn's head. Faramir, who was now the steward of Gondor, cried aloud, "Behold the king!" a cry which was taken up once more by the populace of the city in one voice. With this, King Elessar entered the city to the ringing of silver trumpets as the royal banner was unfurled from the highest tower in the city. Several months later, a company of elves led by Elrond came to the city. He handed over to Aragorn the symbol of royalty in Arnor, the scepter of Anúminas, confirming his status as King of Arnor. Shortly afterward, Aragorn and Arwen were married, with the new Queen of Gondor and Arnor renouncing her immortality for the love she bore the greatest of the line of Isildur.
Oh, kind of like Lúthien did for Baron.
Aragorn became the 26th King of Arnor and the 35th King of Gondor, and the first High King of the reunited kingdom. He would found the House of Telconta and rule until the year 120 of the Fourth Age. Soon after this, a great host led by Aragorn went north, and while the king and the rest of the Fellowship stopped in Rivendell, Gandalf and the hobbits continued onward to the Shire. Dark events transpired in the region in the dying days of the War of the Ring, while the Fellowship was in the south. Using the money earned from selling pipeweed to the wizard Saruman, a relative of Bilbo and Frodo, Lotho Sackville Baggins, initiated a massive land grab, allowing him to take the place of Chief of the Shire. The former White Wizard sent Dunlendings and Goblin men, who the locals started calling ruffians, to assist in this process, providing the necessary support to maintain rule over the hobbits, who were left without protection when the Dunedain went south to support Aragorn. Following the defeat of Sauron, Saruman used the power of his voice, which was one of the last elements of magic he could yet control, to convince Treebeard to allow him to leave the Tower of Isengard. Then, Saruman, under the guise of Sharky, came to the Shire, accompanied by Grima Wormtongue, quickly deposing and imprisoning the former chief and taking direct control over his new dominion. He had begun to turn the once content and peaceful region into an industrialized area, similar to what he had achieved in Isengard. However, Frodo, Sam, Merry and Pippin arrived just in time to thwart his plans to despoil the region in what became known as the Scouring of the Shire. Before entering the Shire, Gandalf, Frodo and company stayed the night in the Prancing Pony in Bree, and were informed by Barlam and Butterbur that the situation had changed. Strange and harsh men from the south had begun to settle around Bree, much to the discontent of men and hobbits who had previously lived in the area. This culminated in a fight on the streets of Bree, where Saruman's forces, led by Bill Ferny, were driven out by the men of Bree, led by Matt Heathertoes. Gandalf then took the hobbits to the edge of the Shire, before leaving to meet with Tom Bombadil, assuring his companions that their training and experiences during the War of the Ring would mean they would meet the challenge with which they were about to be posed. The four hobbits, upon arriving in the
To think that everything we have been through right now, okay, like all of the insane things, I feel like this is like a comedy sketch.
Shire were shocked to see what had become of the home they had fought for so long to protect during the prior events of the War of the Ring.
True.
Having grown much in terms of courage and strength throughout their travels, the returning hobbits soon took up a leadership role, rousing all who wished to put an end to Sharky's cruelty. Prior to this mustering, the leadership of Saruman's ruffians challenged Frodo's authority, but when challenged by the blades of the hobbits, fled, allowing Merry to make use of the Horn of Rohan given to him by Theoden to great effect. Moving swiftly, a force of Shire folk was assembled in short order, and made what preparations they could to meet the forces of the disgraced former wizard. In total, there were 200 Bucklanders, 100 Tooks, and a number of locals supplementing this company, which had to face 150 ruffians. What came next would be known as the Battle of Bywater, and it occurred on November 3rd, TA 3019. As Pippin was still a Knight of Gondor, and wasn't released from his oath by Aragorn, this could also be seen as the first battle in the restoration of Arnor. At this point, the Shire was still a part of the realm of Arnor, allowing the hobbits to engage in combat with the will of the High King of the Dunedain behind them. After being initially rebuked, the leader of the ruffians returned with a larger force. However, they were promptly surrounded, and when he attempted to assault Merry, he was struck down by 4 arrows from the ever-effective archers of the Shire. They displayed the same strength which had allowed them to aid the King of Gondor as far back as the Battle of Fornost. The rest of the ruffians were then arrested and imprisoned. More men were dispatched by Sharky. However, the Hobbit forward scouts gave the members of the Fellowship sufficient time to prepare a defense of Bywater. Merry and Pippin took charge, utilizing everything they had learned during their service in the employ of the King of Rohan and Steward of Gondor. Makeshift roadblocks were prepared using carts and wagons, and when the ruffians arrived, they entered the center of the built-up area, only to find they had been entrapped. The advantages of their greater stature and strength compared to an individual hobbit were eliminated in this way. Attempting a breakout, many were struck down by the deadly volleys of arrows loosed by the hobbits, and those who successfully broke through their entrapment were promptly surrounded and cut down. Sam, Merry and Pippin took an active role in the combat, displaying their martial prowess and inspiring their fellow Shirefolk to hold the line, even though they were not comparable in terms of strength. Frodo meanwhile did not fight, but instead ensured that every ruffian who threw down their arms and surrendered was not slaughtered, but instead imprisoned and treated fairly. The battle was a resounding victory for the Shirefolk, as only 19 hobbits were killed with 30 wounded, compared to the 70 ruffians who were killed and 12 captured, while the remainder of Sharky's men fled the Shire. The following day, Frodo and the other hobbits led their force to Hobbiton to confront Sharky, discovering it was in fact Saruman. The wizard was now powerless, and Frodo exiled him, granting him his life if he was to leave the Shire and never return. Saruman, having been forever tainted by his former master Sauron, responded with characteristic cruelty, decrying the weakness of the hobbits before viciously kicking Grima Wormtongue. This was too much for the former man of Rohan, whose patience broke, and he lunged for the former despot of the Shire, slitting his throat. Before Frodo could stop them, the archers of the Shire reacted, piercing Grima with multiple arrows and ending his life immediately.
Damn.
This was the last military engagement of the War of the Ring. The War of the Ring had far-ranging ramifications for every nation in Middle-earth, none more so than that of Gondor. Aragorn went on to rebuild the Kingdom of Arnor after so many years of decay, fostering close relations with the other realms of men, dwarves and elves, among them Dale and Erebor, who continued to prosper in the Fourth Age. He also successfully campaigned alongside his chief commanders Imrahil and Éomer against the Easterlings and Haradrim, forever ending the threat posed by them. The three men led campaigns beyond the Sea of Ruin, enforcing peace with the Easterlings who dwelt there. Campaigns to the south were also conducted, with the dual might of Gondor and Rohan forcing the men of Harad to give up their possessions in southern Gondor. Likewise, an assault was made on the city of Umbar, which Aragorn had last entered while serving under Denethor's father under the guise of Thorongil. The Corsairs of Umbar were utterly routed, and the port city, which had been founded by the Númenóreans so many centuries prior, was returned to its holdings, with the remaining black Númenóreans who resided there seemingly killed also, bringing an end to their destructive legacy since the fall of Númenor. The Orcs had also been reduced to insignificant mountain bands following the destruction of the Dark Lord, and the United Kingdom, not that one, reached its greatest territorial extent since Elendil first arrived in the west, ensuring there were no longer any true threats to the High Kingship. Aragorn maintained Minas Tirith as his capital, leading to a quick repopulation of the region, reconstructed Annúminas to serve as his northern capital, and rebuilt Fornos Dorain from the ruins of the desolation of the Witch King, constructing a great city in which many men came to reside. The Kingdom of Arnor once more prospered, as the corruption wrought by the Great War in the north was finally cleansed from the region, and it would once more regain the strength it had once possessed at its height. Minas Morgul was razed to the ground, as its corruption would take many years to be fully cleansed from the former joint fortresses of Gondor, with a new holding being built in the Emen Arnen for Faramir and Éowyn to dwell within. Osgiliath was once more rebuilt, also regaining the splendor which had initially made it the first capital of the kingdom, becoming more and more polluted. Aragorn named Faramir Prince of Ithilien, marrying Éowyn, and the Shire was given independent status from the newly re-established realm of Arnor under the scepter of Annúminas. The king even added the Westmarch to its territory, decreeing that no man was ever to enter into the Shire again, himself included. Even after Aragorn's death, following 120 years of wise rule and the accession of his son, Eldarion, the descendants of this line would continue to rule wisely and well, maintaining the golden age started by their patriarch, following on from the flames of war. Meanwhile, Arwen would die just a year after her husband of a broken heart and was buried at Cerin Amroth in Lorien. In Rohan, Éomer assumed the throne, marrying his dear friend Imrahil's daughter, Lothiriel, who he had fallen in love with during his stay in Gondor. He would prove a gallant ally to the Gondorians in the campaigns that followed, ensuring the Oath of Yorl would continue in perpetuity. Isengard was granted to the Ents, who filled in Saruman's pits and reforested the area, renaming it the Treegarth of Orthanc. While in the Glittering Caves, which Gimli had been forced to take refuge in during the Battle of Helm's Deep, permission was given by Éomer for him to set up a Dwarven colony there, which prospered for many years due to the mineral wealth of the caves. The Balrog, being now defeated, also allowed the long-beard dwarfs under Durin VII to retake Khazad-dûm after so many years exiled from their holds. Legolas would go on to found a colony in Ithilien, while his father Thranduil, alongside Celeborn and Galadriel, purged Dol Guldur of corruption and created a land for the Beornings to reside. However, the destruction of the One Ring ensured the decline of the elves, as the Three Rings began to fade in power, causing the kingdoms which had been preserved by them to fade also. This caused a mass exodus of elves across the sea to Valinor, with all three of the ring-bearers departing. Lorien was eventually abandoned, with the elves of Lothlorien who did not depart moving to the southern part of Mirkwood, founding the realm of East Lorien. The majority of the elves of Rivendell also departed, leaving only Elrond's sons, Celeborn, and a small population of elves to inhabit the region. Eventually, Celeborn, whose heart yearned for Galadriel, took passage to the Undying Lands with his company, and it is said that with him went the last living memory of the elder days in Middle-earth. Frodo never truly recovered from his wounds, and upon finishing his version of The Lord of the Rings in the Red Book of Westmarch in the year of the Third Age 3021, joined Bilbo and Gandalf, who by now had achieved all that was required of him in Middle-earth, as well as Elrond and Galadriel aboard an elven ship. Frodo and Bilbo were allowed passage to the Undying Lands, as they were ring-bearers, in the hopes of healing the damage
They're going to Valinor at the end of the movie.
to their spirit that bearing the ring had caused. Sam married Rosie Cotton, having 13 children with her, and was elected Mayor of the Shire for 7 consecutive 7-year terms, before in the year 61 of the Fourth Age, leaving to take a ship to the Undying Lands as a former ring-bearer to join Frodo in Valinor.
Damn.
Meanwhile, Merry became the Master of Buckland in the year 11 of the Fourth Age, living at Brandy Hall and also Crickhollow, and in the year 13 of the Fourth Age, Pippin became the 32nd Thane of the Shire, a position he maintained for 40 years, before renouncing it in the year 63 of the Fourth Age, when he revisited Rohan and Gondor with Merry. Merry was 102 years old at this stage, and died in Gondor not long after arriving, being laid to rest in Gondor. Pippin died not long after, and was laid to rest with Merry in Gondor. After the great King Elisar died in the year 120 of the Fourth Age, Merry and Pippin were entombed next to him. After Aragorn's death, Legolas and Gimli left their respective colonies in the hands of their people. The pair, that had grown incomprehensibly close despite initial frictions between them, then went west, where Legolas built one last ship at the Havens to take them across the sea towards Valinor. In doing so, Gimli became the first and only ever dwarf to make his way to the Undying Lands. Neither of them was ever seen again in Middle-earth, and lived in Valinor with their old friends to the very dying days of the world.
Damn. Damn, what a video. Ooh. It's really, really hot here right now. And I have no way of getting more wind in here. Oh, damn. That's pretty wild. That was a lot happening here. We got to see the streets of Minas Tirith, the White City. Quite interesting. It's really, really different from the movies, honestly. Did not know there was a big wall. Yeah. And the curse with the guys from The Last Lions, that was, I don't know why Aragorn didn't have them join in like the war at Pelennor Fields. Yeah, the strategy at the Black Gate was also way better here than it was in the movies. Honestly, it looked way better in the movies. Obviously, that's kind of probably why they did it. The charge was pretty awesome. So yeah, and that's Saruman, like his little uprising in the Shire just seemed like an absolute comedy to me. It was so stupid. Oh, yeah. Damn, that was a lot. And like Gimli is gone, Legolas is gone, Merry, Pippin, Sam, Frodo, they all went to Valinor. Except for Eowyn and Aragorn. They just died. Pretty sad. But it's pretty interesting to see like there's like a bit of inspiration from Baron and Luthien in those two. So that was pretty cute. Yeah, it seems like a lot of... I'm curious, like, with the fertile land in Mordor, they talked about, like... I remember, like, just that place being filled with completely black, like... Did not look like anything could grow there, so, Yeah, damn. Quite a wild trip here. The original video will be down in the description, guys. If you guys want to check out some more Middle Earth videos, I'll have a playlist up on screen. If you guys want to check out some history videos, I'll have another playlist up on screen. Otherwise, please like, share, and subscribe to the comment to the video. That would be amazing. Otherwise, see you guys later. Bye.